So, Dr. Kemp, we were just talking about the evaluation of executive dysfunction for folks with brain impairment, and you were saying that there are some strategies that you use that get at executive dysfunction in various ways. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yes, I'd be glad to. Over the last several years, I've conducted probably hundreds of evaluations of people living in their own homes, and we'll go out usually in the context of whether or not abuse had occurred to these individuals. And so it was important to evaluate their mental status as part of that evaluation. And I found that it was necessary to approach the idea of whether a person had problems with executive function in multiple ways, because different people show it in different ways. And so I would always include a number of different tasks, including things like picture completion, to see if people could understand what was going on with that. I set up a series of numbers that made a logical sequence to them to see if the person could then figure out the next number of the sequence. I would use the clock design or clock drawing test as a way of seeing whether people could figure out what to do with the hands or whether they could comprehend the instructions on it. And I especially look for things like insight, whether the person was aware of their own circumstances, aware of their own limitations, and could recognize those or could not recognize those. And of course, an important part of executive dysfunction is whether people can make proper decisions. And so I would often have them I would give them a suitable situation, such as, suppose you were told that you need to have surgery. How would you go about deciding whether or not you would have that kind of surgery or not? What would you do? And you'd find great variation in people's ability to comprehend the question, and a great variation in terms of what people would do to plan to whether they would do it or not. At the same time, there is a test I like to use because it got at the idea of implications and whether people can understand implications of things. So there's a paragraph in one of the Wechsler tests of memory, and I had people read it out loud to make sure they could first understand what they were reading, and then I'd ask them what did they understand about the story, what was its general meaning, and then I'd ask them specifically for an implication of one of the sentences in the story that the information wasn't contained in the sentence, but by implication you could figure it out. And so a combination of, usually I use about between 8 and 10 different measures of executive dysfunction to get at whether or not the person had these kinds of problems, plus paying attention to whether they were slow, made multiple mistakes, needed more time to pay attention to instructions, misunderstood the instructions, weren't able to pay attention well enough to the instructions, things like that, to form an overall opinion about whether there was a problem with executive dysfunction.
Well, that's great. Thank you. You said something about actually going out to people's homes to do this. Was that an important part of what you were doing?
Oh, absolutely. Because there's great clues in the way the person's living that tell you how they're doing. For example, a person with executive dysfunction would frequently have stacks and stacks of bills on their table at home and mail because they couldn't get organized enough to sort it all out or know what to do with it. They'd often get letters from the utility companies telling them they were going to turn off the power or turn off the gas if the bill didn't get paid, yet the person still couldn't put it together about how to get organized enough to even pay the bill. And going out in the person's home, you can see how well they're living. You can look in the refrigerator, see what kind of food is there or not there, whether it's been expired or not, whether the person has a plan for their day, how they organize their activities, whether they even keep their house clean. And all those things point to problems with executive dysfunction.
As you take a look at that kind of evaluation, in my experience, it's unusual for psychologists to go out and do that. Obviously, that's optimal. If you had an occupational therapist that you collaborated with who could go out and do that in the person's home, is that something that you would entertain?
Oh, I'd be very welcome for that kind of input. Occupational therapists are, by training, very good observers and can report back on how the person is doing along these lines that I pointed out.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's
You're welcome.
great insight. Thank you.